So right behind the camera is Hancock Avenue. This is the line of General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps of the Army of the Potomac. And right across this field, way down there, that tree line right down there, that is the Army of Northern Virginia's battle line, extending all the way down from that side, all the way down the field, going to all the way down to basically the little round top, big round top, Devil's Den, all the way on the other side. But this field is where the very famous, very well known Pickett's charge occurred on July 3rd, 1863. Now, as you can see, Pickett's charge was open ground. This was vast open ground. You have the Emmitsburg Road basically in the middle of this field, not per se in the middle, but approximately closer to the Union line here. And so I'm not going to get further into detail about Pickett's charge per se on this side of the field, but I will say that you might say, well, you know, this vast, you know, open land, what was General Lee even thinking? Why would he even send his troops across a huge open field where they could be absolutely massacred by Union artillery on this line? Not only the line of the 2nd Corps, but also artillery up on Cemetery Hill, which is going to that direction, and also going further down the line, all the way down to Little Round Top and the wheat field, the peach orchard, all the way to that area. Union Army had a bunch of artillery fixed on that position. And many people could say, well, why would he do that? Why would Lee even do that? That's suicide. Well, technically not, okay? And you must understand the circumstances that Lee was placed under in order to make that executive decision, in order to send his men across this field right there. So why would Lee even do that? Well, General Lee, for many Indians that remember what me saying, is that he attacked Cemetery Hill July 2nd, and then he attacked basically Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the wheat field, the peach orchard on July 2nd. The coordinated attacks on that side of the field and that side of the field. So on July 3rd, he assumed, which was a good assumption as a military commander, he assumed that the Union would strengthen its forces on both sides of the fishhook, on Cemetery Hill and up on Little Round Top, those general areas. So he assumed that this line of the 2nd Corps on Cemetery Ridge, that this straight line would be softer, that they wouldn't have as many defenses up on this part of the hill, or this part of the fishhook, which is very insightful. Okay, General Lee was not an idiot. He was smart. But it says here on this plaque, Pettigrew's charge, July 3rd, 1863. So what we have right here is we have General Pickett. Then we got Trimble and Pettigrew. Okay, so Pettigrew and Trimble are coming this direction. So we are right here. Pickett is coming all the way over on that side. Pettigrew and Trimble are coming this way, to this side. Okay? So what's happening is, this is a coordinated attack on Seminary Ridge. Pickett's division, Pettigrew's division, they're going to come across this open field like I already said. Now, since we're right here on Hancock Avenue, General Hancock's 2nd Corps is placed along Cemetery Ridge. This is Cemetery Ridge. They're basically out probably right in this vicinity. They're going to send their men across this field. They're going to get absolutely bombarded. They are going to get massacred. But General Lee is willing to take that gamble because he knows he has no other strategy left in the book. He has, you know, it's either do or die. It's either you go across this field and you take your chances on the soft line, or you lose the war in general, because he has to win a major engagement upon Union soil in order to negotiate peace terms with DC, which is a very insightful thing for the Army of Northern Virginia's commander. And people don't realize that in 2025, they don't take that for granted, or they do take it for granted that they think, oh, he's just an idiot. You know, he doesn't know what he's doing. That's stupid. Why would he do it? But you got to understand how desperate the circumstances were for the Army of Northern Virginia in order to place yourself in the shoes of General Robert E. Lee on July 3rd, 1863. But now I'm going to go further down on Cemetery Ridge and talk a little bit more about the very famous copse of trees right there, which was basically the main goal of Pickett's charge, was to meet at the copse of trees. Very famous. And I'm going to be talking about what happened there further, so bear with me. So this right here is the monument dedicated to the commander of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Army, for many yins that don't know. This is George Meade, Pennsylvania man, part of my home state of Pennsylvania. George Meade, for many yins that don't know, was promoted as the commander of the Army of the Potomac on June 28th, 1863. So this was not a command that he took with pleasure. He did not say, oh, goody, I'm the commander of the Army of the Potomac. The previous commander, Joseph Hooker, was then fired and basically told, you're useless, get out of here. And he was then promoted as the Army of the Potomac's commander. Now, they had many other applicants, not applicants, but people that they could have, called upon to serve as the commander of the Army of the Potomac, one of them being John Fulton Reynolds, commander of the Army's First Corps, which Reynolds basically said, well, if I command the Army of the Potomac, am I going to be able to have basically full control without Washington, D.C.'s basically oversight and basically bossiness? Which then they said no. They said, no, Reynolds, you're going to be told what to do, and you're going to be basically surveillanced by us in D.C. And Reynolds said, well, I want nothing to do with it. So basically, Meade was just basically told, well, guess what, George? You are now the commander of the Army of the Potomac. And he's like, yay. So basically born December 31st, 1815, died November 6th, 1872. General Meade actually won the Battle of Gettysburg. With his strategy and with his insight and with his genius, this man was able to beat the very famous and the very unbeatable General Robert E. Lee. But what are the circumstances about George Meade and Robert E. Lee at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg? Why is it that General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, why was he so prominent? And why was George Meade, why was he a formidable opponent against the very unbeatable Robert E. Lee? Well, George Meade was very conservative. Basically, in the military sense, he was very patient. He wasn't willing to basically chase Lee and, fight on Lee's terms. Meade basically said, well, too many Army of the Potomac commanders, too many commanders basically fall into Lee's traps. And he said, I'm not going to fall into this trap anymore. I'm going to fight Lee on my ground of my choosing. Basically, I'm going to make Lee fight me. I'm going to be on the defensive and Lee's going to be on the offensive, which was very different. This battle was very different. If you look at the timeline of the Civil War, especially in Virginia or in the eastern part of the United States, you will see, or not the United States, the eastern part of North America at the time, basically the Confederate States going to the border of the Mason-Dixon, you will see that General Robert E. Lee is always beating the Army of the Potomac in these battles because Lee is then on the defensive. Lee picks the battlefields, Lee decides what the battle is going to consist of, and then the Army of the Potomac falls under that trap and basically gets obliterated, and the Army of the Potomac, aka the Union Army, the USA, loses. But on this battlefield, George Gordon Meade, being a Pennsylvania man, he is not going to fall under this trap like many of his predecessors. Meade is going to say, you know what, Lee? You might think you're going to come up here to my home state. You might think you're going to come under Union ground or Union territory, but you're not going to take this ground. I am going to set up my defense here, connecting, like I said, from Cemetery Hill, across Cemetery Ridge, going all the way to Little Round Top. And I am going to decide the fate of this battlefield. I am going to decide the terms of who wins this battle. And that is why it was so prominent and so important that Lee did not fall under the trap of attacking Meade. And that's why General Longstreet over on the Army of Northern Virginia, Longstreet said to Lee, said, we should not be fighting here. We should not fight this battle because they have the high ground. They have the defensive position. We don't, General. And Lee's like, but sir, the enemy is here. The enemy is here. We must fight him. And yes, that is true. Okay, and the desperation being that you're on enemy ground, you're in foreign territory, you're on the enemy soil. I understand Lee's desperation to be able to cause the Union to be capitulated in order to negotiate peace terms in D.C. But General James Longstreet, his lieutenant general, basically his second in command, Longstreet's insight as a defensive strategist, he knows that General Robert E. Lee is falling under the trap of George Gordon Meade, commander of the Army of the Potomac. Meade is waiting and wanting Lee to attack him up here on this defensive high ground. At the end of the day, it's an absolute tragedy for Robert E. Lee. And I'm going to sympathize because I am not prejudiced. I'm not saying, yeah, go Union, woohoo! I'm also saying, yeah, go Confederates too, because I have blood on both sides. I have skin in the game on both gray and blue. And I'm not saying that Lee's an idiot, because Lee is desperate. And I actually empathize and sympathize with Lee. I understand what he's going through and what's going through his brain as commander of the Army of the Potomac. And so many people that doubt Lee and say, well, Lee was an idiot. He should have known better, blah, 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 blah. Well, put yourself in his shoes and understand the circumstances and the terms, and understand how desperate he was to win the war for the Confederate States of America. Put yourself in Lee's shoes. Instead of judging with prejudice and pointing fingers in 2025 and saying, well, Lee, you're an idiot. You should have known better. No, dude. Put yourself in his shoes and empathize and sympathize and understand the terms and the circumstances of what Lee was trying to do up here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Then you'll be able to understand the full scope and the circumstances of what the Battle of Gettysburg consisted of. But anyway, I'm going to be going down to the famous copse of trees, like I said in my video before, but this time I promise I'm going down to the copse of trees, so bear with me. So that clump of trees right back there, that is the very famous copse of trees here at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863, during Longstreet's assault, which it's very debatable on what the very famous charge was called. Some historians call it Longstreet's assault. Some people call it Pickett's charge. Some people call it Pickett's Pettigrew and Trimble charge. But regardless, it's a charge. It's a full-on Confederate assault across this battlefield. Now, when Confederate forces were coming across the field, once they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, they're already facing artillery fire over on Cemetery Hill and over as far as Little Round Top. Now, Little Round Top's artillery fire isn't able to hit Pettigrew and Trimble's force coming on that side of the battlefield. So over there, they're too far away. But over here, where General Pickett's division, my mom's ancestors of the 19th Virginia, Army of Northern Virginia, they're able, Little Round Top's artillery is able to touch them, okay? So they're basically being fired on both sides, or all sides, basically left, right, center, okay? And so right here, this is the famous, let's just say, epicenter of where everybody's going to meet. Not everybody, but most of the force is going to meet over here at the copse of trees. So before the assault, or before the famous charge, General Longstreet then tells his commanders, he tells Pickett, he tells Pettigrew and Trimble, he tells all of the commanders, tell your men to meet at this very clump of trees, this copse of trees. This is a very prominent, very famous landmark here at the Battle of Gettysburg, which basically most of the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate forces, would converge on. In this area, this is called the angle, because the line actually breaks up and then comes like this, and it cuts into an angle. And so this is this is the approximate location of where my mother's cousins, her relatives of the 19th Virginia, this is where they would come and basically break the stone wall or the stone defense right here. They would actually break this, and they would go into hand-to-hand fighting with men of the Army of the Potomac, the Union Second Corps, right here, right in front of, or right near the famous copse of trees here on Hancock Avenue on July 3rd. Well, it was called Hancock Avenue at the time, but now it is presently. But this is what happened on July 3rd, 1863. And I am going to get closer to the copse of trees. This is actually my first time ever primarily over here on this side of the battlefield talking about these aspects, especially on the Union Army's Second Corps line on Hancock Avenue. Very interesting. Let's get closer. So right behind me is the famous copse of trees, which I was told in a YouTube video that this clump of trees, it's called a copse. Okay, the word's not really prominent in the English language, but let's just call it, for many of you, the clump of trees. So this is the famous clump of trees here on the Second Corps line extending down this way. This, like I said, this is the main point that the Army of Northern Virginia is focusing on while they're on the other side of the field. So it says right here that, quote, this is a person writing for the Richmond Enquirer named Jonathan Albertson, said, "I have never seen since the war began, and I have been in all the great fights of this army, troops enter a fight in such splendid order as did this splendid division of Pickett's. On presses Pickett's brave Virginians, and now the enemy open upon them more than 50 guns, a terrible fire of grape, shell, and canister." So once Pickett's division, so the orientation, talking about my mother's ancestors, my mother's distant cousins from Massey's Mill, Nelson County, Virginia, the 19th Virginia under Garnett's brigade, Armistead's brigade, oh my God, Armistead, or Garnett, and what's his name? The other brigade commander. Oh my God, you guys are gonna crucify me. Okay, Kemper's brigade. Woo! I almost killed that one. So when the Pickett's division is starting to basically approach this this line, the Confederates are opened up upon by the Army of the Potomac Second Corps up here. Once they're starting to cross the Emmitsburg Road, so that fence line going right there across the battlefield, once they cross the Emmitsburg Road, then the Union Army artillery up here near the copse of trees, is specifically and approximately, they are told to open up with basically grape shot. Okay, grape shot is about that round. Okay, it's a little bit rounder, and it's basically iron balls. And these iron balls are fragmented like literal shotgun shells, the pellets, big pellets, firing across this line and basically tearing holes in the Army of Northern Virginia, especially Pickett's division's men, the Virginians, coming across the line here. Now, their goal is basically to penetrate this line right here, this basically stone wall that's right in front, so like the fence right here, they're basically going to penetrate this stone wall and try to take this line and try to penetrate this line and push it all the way up Cemetery Ridge to Cemetery Hill. And as we can see down here, I'm going to get a little bit closer. This is a monument to the 69th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which is designated as a Irish regiment. Okay, and like many of you realize from my past videos, as I already said, regiments sometimes in the Civil War are segregated and distinctly ethnic, meaning you have German regiments or Irish regiments. And this one is specifically an Irish regiment, consisted of Pennsylvania boys from my beloved home state of PA. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get closer to the wall to show you a little bit more of the perspective of what the defenders of the Second Corps were seeing when Pickett's division was crossing the Emmitsburg Road on July 3rd, 1863. But I wanted to give another shout out to, oh God, camera flip. I want to give a wee bit of a shout out to the copse of trees right here, because it's very interesting. Oh, I forgot to tell you this too. This copse of trees right here, I was told in a video on YouTube, this is only to be walked on by certain invited persons or people. This is not open to the public. Like, for example, the public can't just walk into this place and walk around. You have to be invited and introduced by the National Park Service. It's protected by a fence, as you can see. And this is where fierce fighting happened on July 3rd, 1863, once the Army of Northern Virginia penetrated this wall. The Union defenders fell back a little bit, trying to basically give a little bit of room for the reinforcements to come up and basically create some space between the Army Second Corps and the Army Northern Virginia's Pickett's division. Basically create a little bit of space in order to basically create good musketry fire in order to repel the Army of Northern Virginia and stop them from basically penetrating further up here in this area. So right now, like I said, I'm going to go down to the fence to show you a little bit of first-person perspective of what that would have looked like. So I'm down here at the 69th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment Monument, and this is the very famous stone wall that the Second Corps would have been hiding behind and protecting themselves on the morning or on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863. So to give a little bit of first-person perspective of what that would have looked like, so the men of the Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac, the U.S. Army, the Union Army, they're basically hiding behind the stone wall. They're getting as low as they can, waiting for Pickett's division or the Confederates to cross that field. And as you can see, the field, I don't know if you can see it from this perspective, but the field has, it goes up and down a little bit. There's natural defense or natural protections a little bit more than most fields. It's not as flat. But regardless, this stone wall, this is what would have been protecting or defending the Union Army of Army of the Potomac soldiers of the Second Corps. So right now they're getting as low as they can, because further up the hill, as you can see, the hill actually raises on Cemetery Ridge. That is where the artillery would be. So while the infantry is hiding behind this stone wall right here, approximately right here, the artillery is going to be opening up long range. But once the Confederates cross the Emmitsburg Road right there, that fence line right down there, once they cross that fence line, then the artillery will open up with the canister and grape shot, okay? Once they get closer, approximately in that location, that's when they say, okay, let's open up with double canister. Let's open up with grape shot. Let's just spray that line as best as we can to create basically holes in the line to be able to slow down and prevent the Army of Northern Virginia's advance up into this position. So once the Army of Northern Virginia breaches this wall, because they do, let me just show you what that might have looked like. Let's get over this wall a little bit. Okay, so my mother's relatives, okay, the Pontons of Massey's Mill, Nelson County, Virginia, of the 19th Virginia, they basically breached this stone wall, and they're moving like this. They're coming up, and the stone wall actually slows down the advance a little bit, slows down the charge, which many people don't know. There was hand-to-hand combat, especially between the 69th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment and the Army of Northern Virginia's forces up here on this stone wall. Now, the Irish were very prominent and very famous for not retreating. They were willing to stand toe-to-toe against the advancing Confederates of the Army of Northern Virginia. But my mother's ancestors, the Pontons of Nelson County, Virginia, the 19th Virginia Infantry Regiment, many of those distant cousins were taken prisoner here at the stone wall, or up here on the Cemetery Ridge line of the Second Corps. And what's interesting is that the Army of Northern Virginia not only lost a lot of men wounded or killed up here during the famous Pickett's charge, but they also lost a lot of men that were captured or wounded. Specifically, some of my distant cousins were captured or wounded while breaching this wall on Cemetery Ridge on July 3rd, 1863. and a lot of battle flags were captured here. A lot of Army of Northern Virginia, let's just say Confederate flags for many Indians that don't know. It's called the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag. Many of those flags were captured here while the Army of Northern Virginia breached this stone wall on July 3rd, 1863. And for many of the regiments of the 2nd Corps of the Army of the Potomac, this repulse, or this defense of the famous Pickett's charge or Longstreet's assault, this was very let's just say inspirational for them, because they were put in that position at Fredericksburg in December of 1862, very close to Gettysburg timeline wise, where Army of Northern Virginia was then the defenders behind a stone wall, and the Army of the Potomac was then advancing and trying to breach and trying to take that stone wall. So when the Army of Northern Virginia was then repulsed and pushed back and defeated during their advance, many of these men up here on the stone wall shouted Fredericksburg. They actually mocked the Army of Northern Virginia, basically telling them, hey, Virginians, we just beat you the way you beat us at Fredericksburg, so now we're going to give it back to you as revenge. And this is basically the turning point, the high watermark of the Civil War. This Pickett's charge or Longstreet's assault, this is the turning point of the Civil War, and this is going to begin the defeat of the Confederacy following into the end surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 9th, 1865. But anyway, this is the line here, the 2nd Corps on Cemetery Ridge, July 3rd, 1863. I'm going to keep going down further to the Pennsylvania Monument down there and talk further about what's going on, going closer to Sickles Line, following the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and then Little Round Top. I'll meet you down there.